Let's talk about the term regressive left, which has emerged in many spheres of political conversation, especially on the internet, but the concept is not really new. Regressive left is meant to describe an ostensibly liberal person who actually abandons liberal principles for causes like political correctness, authoritarianism, censorship, or even fanaticism. The term regressive is correctly used in these contexts, but it's equally worth noting that the term regressive leftist is often overused, misused, and it's even been transformed into an ad hominem attack, sometimes even co-opted by conservatives or anti-feminists or bigots who just like to use it to snarl at liberals that aren't even regressive in the first place and not in the original true meaning of the term. The first point I want to make about the idea of being regressive is that it's not equivalent to being very or overly liberal or being harmful in one's liberalness. Regressive liberalism is not further left on the political spectrum. Instead, being regressive is a failure to be liberal. To be regressive is not to espouse far left ideas. The opposite is actually the case. Real progressives should appropriately criticize things like religion and political correctness when they are damaging. Being regressive would be, for example, using false accusations of bigotry against opponents to silence or defame them, or to stop debate and conversation about something. Labeling a demographic group such as Islam as immune from any wrongdoing or criticism because they are in some way disenfranchised is an example of regressive thinking. Without question, there are conversations and topics where regressive leftists impede conversations by these means. But discourse cannot be taboo. Once discourse has started, either side of a debate should be free to refute the other. But trying to stigmatize certain debates, such as the link between Islam and terrorism, so that they don't even occur in both real-time interactions and in the sort of broader societal sense, is not a liberal thing to do. All topics, no matter how sensitive or uncomfortable to discuss, should be open for discussion. Otherwise, the integrity of journalism, research, and education can quickly be eroded. This is also extended to mediums like Twitter, which has been accused of censoring certain non-politically correct tweets and has intentionally removed regressive left from its hashtag autofill menu. Sort of ironic. In the words of Noam Chomsky, if we don't believe in freedom of expression for people we despise, we don't believe in it at all. However far back you want to look in American history, we've seen conservatives stifling reasonable discussion about any number of topics. You're an outright commie if you even have the slightest critique about our capitalist system. Anyone who criticizes our foreign policy is failing to support the troops, and so on. As progressives, do we really want to fall into the same tendency of just completely shutting down discourse that could challenge our narratives? We have to admit that there is a threshold that makes someone a racist or bigot. And in effect, overusing these types of words weakens them when they actually deserve to be used. If you watch my program, you know that I'm a feminist. I promote feminist values, and I actively denounce misogyny, sexism, and gender inequality. But I also know that there's a detectable portion of feminists who are fervently intolerant of any critiques of feminist assertions or tactics. Some feminists actively work to stomp out any questioning of their paradigms, like patriarchies, psychologies between men and women, sexual violence statistics, claims about the gender pay gap, and so on. These are all topics that are worth discussing, and these are all topics where the feminist view is at minimum partially correct, but we must be able to have the debates and not stigmatize or silence anyone who even wants to inquire about these issues. This sort of harsh enforcement of feminism has far more in common with right-wing authoritarianism and censorship than liberalism and progressivism, and it is definitely uncharacteristic of liberal values. Shouldn't our universities be fertile ground for any type of intellectual discussion, preserving a marketplace of ideas? If certain ideas are unreasonable enough, won't that become evident once the controversy gets hashed out and discussed? Why should we be so afraid of even exposing people to certain ideas? That is certainly a right-wing tactic. So let's shift gears then and talk about the notion of regressive left as it would apply to the subject of religion, and in particular, controversies related to Islam. Having empathy for minorities and the disenfranchised, which Muslims in America definitely are, is one of the most valuable and inherent inclinations that we have as liberals. Multiculturalism and anti-imperialism are paramount values. Anti-Muslim bigotry is real in the United States and elsewhere. Something we discuss all the time on this show is that by far, most terrorism in the US is committed by Christians, not Muslims. And after Jews, Muslims are the most frequent victims of hate crimes in the United States. Muslims are without question a huge target of prejudice and hate, and it's completely unacceptable. And all progressives intrinsically seem very willing to have that very worthy conversation. On the other hand, though, some factions of the left are often far less eager to explore the associations between Islam and violence or human rights abuses, or that most of the world's terrorism today is committed by Islamic extremists, explicitly in the name of Islam. And if poverty and oppression were exclusively the causes of these phenomena, we'd see terrorism committed by blacks in America, impoverished people in Latin America, etc. We're finding out more and more every day that terrorists, even high-ranking members of ISIS or those that committed the atrocities of 9/11, were educated and otherwise psychologically stable people, obviously, other than their willingness to commit heinous acts of terror.
Nobody accused me of being anti-Semitic because I was criticizing a particular set of religious beliefs as held by Jewish Orthodox men. By the same token, if I were to criticize the Catholic Church's position vis-a-vis abortions, one wouldn't say that I am being Catholicophobic or bigoted or racist. Regrettably, though, when it comes to criticizing one particular ideology, and I think we all know which one it is, Islam, the common stance in today's polite society is that to criticize the religious tenets of that ideology is simply unacceptable.
The left has no problem calling out Christians and Jews, but often it's all of a sudden considered distasteful and hateful to criticize dogmatism in the case of Islam. Many Muslims around the world have been oppressed by U.S. foreign policy, but to write off all Islam-inspired violence as the result of American oppression is totally intellectually dishonest and achieves nothing other than stifling honest debate and progress.
The taboo around criticizing religion as opposed to other sets of ideas, that is something that people are really biased against tolerating. They think there's something indecent, just as a matter of principle, in criticizing people's deeply held religious convictions, whereas there is nothing wrong with criticizing their false ideas about history or biology or anything else. And there's also a lot of white guilt and understandable guilt over the history of slavery and colonialism and the sheer wealth imbalance between the West or the developed nations and the developing ones. And so a criticism of Islam in particular gets mapped onto those concerns about inequalities in our world, and you get you get a lot of confusion.
Neither side of this debate about the regressive left can deny that there are liberals who do use cultural relativism and distaste for U.S. foreign policy as an excuse to defend or at least minimize violence and injustice that they would certainly otherwise oppose. But it's curious that when Muslims do something violent or fascistic in the name of Islam, people like Reza Aslan frequently discount Islam as a factor. And then when we see movements for peace and justice in a Muslim country, people like Aslan are quick to point out the Islamic setting and thus how praiseworthy Islam is. Regressives say that when they do defend Islam or illiberal acts by Muslims, they are doing so for good reason and with proper context. The regressive would say that Islamic terrorism, if they were even willing to use that term, they would say that Islamic terrorism is wrong, but that there are larger historical, political, and economic contexts in which it all must be understood. That may be true, but the non-apologist who uses the term regressive, like me, often feels that there is sufficient evidence to believe that religion is an important motive in many of these scenarios, and that religion itself deserves an inspection, just as we do with Christianity, with Judaism, with Mormonism and Scientology, or any other religion or cult that deserves analysis. Just for a second, imagine what we would be hearing from the left if Scientologists all over the world were abusing women and setting off bombs in the name of Scientology. It's also important to acknowledge that not all people who are critical of religious extremism and this type of moral relativism are the same. Sam Harris has different views on Islam and politics than Majid Nawaz, whose ideas are very different than those of, for example, Bill Maher, whose views differ from Dave Rubin or Richard Dawkins or Maryam Namazi or Christopher Hitchens, Ayaan Hirsi Ali, Salman Rushdie, etc. All of the above are progressives, two of whom are Marxists, no less, and they just share this common desire for open dialogue about religion and how it can inspire real-life calamity, but they all have completely different views on foreign policy. Some regressives will say, why spend energy taking on regressives when you should be focusing on denouncing the right? My response is the idea of challenging regressives doesn't need to be thought of as a civil war among the left. We're all on the same side. We're just trying to disarm those on the right who might have legitimate criticisms of these types of progressives, such as their stonewalling on legitimate debates. While all progressives have a responsibility to criticize conservatives, it's also necessary to do some housekeeping on our side to make sure that we're taken seriously. And to that point, it seems like many progressives just create more strife than necessary with their non-regressive allies. Is it really the most productive use of a regressive's time to continuously demonize people with whom they share the same views on almost all issues?
It's so dumb because, you know, all the people who are accused of being Islamophobes, like you and me and Sam and Ian, we're liberals. We're liberals about everything.
Many, if not most of those who are progressive and also criticize Islam are just as liberal on foreign policy as any other progressive. When it comes to Islam, calling a spade is not synonymous with neoconservatism the way that many want to claim. Criticism of Islam does not need to lead to drone strikes or nuclear war. Islamism and Western militarism are both right-wing concepts that need to be picked apart by progressives.
And so what I mean by the regressive left is this phenomenon of people on the left wing of the debate who see between their duty, their ideological duty to challenge foreign policy mistakes, American and British foreign policy mistakes, so what they interpret as colonialism and neocolonialism and neoconservatism. Mm-hmm. They see it as their duty to challenge this, and then they see another challenge, which is theocracies and the Islamist ideology, and they have come to the view that you can't challenge both of these together, because if you were to challenge Islamist theocracy, you're supporting neoconservative foreign policy.
And maybe you're a liberal who's thinking, okay, fine, so Islam has inspired some bad things, but why would you be so focused on it? There are no practical implications. There's no way to productively use these notions in the real world. Well, not only would you be wrong for a number of reasons to which we would need to dedicate an entire separate segment, but you've also just more or less admitted that you have ulterior motives that are influencing what you're willing to say about Islam. Here is the fundamental fallacious assumption on which a lot of regressives are operating. Holding Islam to the same standard that we hold religions like Christianity by default leads to right-wing foreign policy, therefore Islam is completely benign. This statement makes no sense. Regressives, a lot of the time, make conversations about religion and ideas for conversations about foreign policy or the pragmatics of intercultural relations. A discourse about how outsiders can productively interact with Muslims is totally distinct from a candid conversation about the ethics and influence of the Quran. The fact that someone like Sam Harris would be ineffective as a communicator to most of the Muslim world does not invalidate his observations about Islam. Islam must be reformed from within, but we can't allow our fear of offending Muslims to show the skewing of our perception of reality when it comes to religious dogma. If I were to point out to you that misogyny exists in the world and some of it is because of Islam, what sense would it make for you to respond and tell me that I'm discounting or ignoring Muslim feminists, or that I'm insulting Muslims, or that I'm affirming secular dictatorships? It wouldn't be true, nor would it even be relevant. Absolutely, there are right and wrong moves when it comes to collaborating with the Muslim world in order to defeat terrorism and theocracy, but that has no bearing on what is or is not true about the Quran and psychology. But, like I said, we also must keep in mind that the term regressive left is misused in many situations, often to suggest that someone is overly liberal. This is how many right-wingers are incorrectly using the term, and it's a sort of bastardization of the idea. When a video gamer calls a woman a regressive because he doesn't believe in feminism and thinks that women are just too sensitive about certain things, no liberal values are being defended there. This is a total misuse of the term regressive left. This fallacious usage of the term is far too common, and it detracts from more legitimate criticisms that can be made about true regressive leftists. There are too many people who are just hiding behind the term regressive left as a way of expressing that they disagree with liberalism, many of whom are truly bigots. This has little to do with Majid Nawaz's original use of the term. To the same point, it's suspicious that besides when we're talking about Islam, we mostly only hear regressive left used in reference to race, gender, and sexuality. People don't seem to use the term against any other liberal positions. For instance, you hardly ever hear anybody say, oh, you're so regressive with your advocacy of universal health care or abortion rights. And then when you do hear something like that, it's just a right-winger using the word regressive to insult a liberal. So to recap, the term regressive left is definitely misused by conservatives against defenders of women, ethnic minorities, gays and lesbians, and so on. But on the other hand, any idea, including Islam and fanatical authoritarianism by feminists, should be subject to scrutiny. So the notion of regressive left is 100% valid, but only when used appropriately. You can't be bigoted against an ideology. And as progressives, let's not use the term when it doesn't apply, nor allow the term to be co-opted by right-wingers. But by no means should we throw out the concept of the regressive left. Regressives absolutely do exist.